Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be doing an interview in just a few minutes with Dr. Robert Jeffress, Pastor Jeffress, and his new book, Invincible. But first of all, let me cover a couple of stories before we get to that interview, and then, of course, we'll cover some more of those stories in the next hour. First of all, Texas has become the first state to implement the fetal heartbeat bill. You might say, well, there are other states that have passed it, yes, but this is the first one to implement it because of the peculiar and very interesting way the law is written. And so we'll talk about that. So in some respects, up until now, there have been attempts to move that direction, but this is the first one that is very successful. We'll talk also, sadly, probably do that next hour, of the stories of Americans left behind in Afghanistan. It is a sad list indeed. And if you received our prayer alert yesterday, we suggested there could be 1,000 if you add both Americans and some of these individuals who hopefully would be American citizens someday who are Afghanistan and Afghanis. But most people say at least 300. We have no idea, but I want to give you at least a story of a few of these individuals and see how tragic it is. One of the articles we have posted here is the suicide hotline for Veterans Administration received more than 35,000 calls during the Afghan evacuation. I think we know why, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later next hour. Certainly a good deal of evidence right now in terms of one of the articles we posted on the deception that the government is using, because they don't want you to realize that inflation is taking place. But you go to the grocery store and you pay rent and mortgage and you know what's going on, but we're going to talk about that in some detail. And then if we have time, I do want to spend some time maybe just giving us a little bit of history, because Harvard University, which was founded by a man who was a chaplain, John Harvard, basically after he died, they took some of his books and other things and named it for him. They have a new chaplain, and it's an atheist. No, I'm not kidding. I mean, the new chaplain at Harvard University is an atheist, so we'll talk about that. But I did also want to mention that we have our action item today, and that is to contact your 2 United States senators about H.R. 4. So just before this segment is over, I want to get into that, and then we'll do our interview with Pastor Robert Jeffress. But let me take this first article here, because it is striking that the Texas law banning abortions after a fetal heartbeat can be detected went into effect today. Starting on the first day of September, the laws that were passed by the Texas legislature are now enacted. And usually what happens is, as soon as a law is going to go into effect, various pro-abortion lawyers can go and do some judge shopping and find a judge that will issue an injunction. And yet, interestingly enough, in this particular case, both the Supreme Court and the Federal Appeals Court said, no, we don't think so. So this may be the first time you actually have a fetal heartbeat bill that has actually been implemented. Yes, others have been passed. There are 12 other states that have passed fetal heartbeat laws, and those, of course, have been struck down. But this makes at least Texas the first state to successfully implement the measure. If you want to understand what it means, a heartbeat is usually detected in about the 6th week of pregnancy, although I have have written about before, in a matter of fact, even in our booklet that we have on abortion, that the heart is formed much earlier. But if you use just even heartbeat, then I think is a very powerful argument, because if it's the cessation of heartbeat that we use to define death, could you not use the onset of heartbeat to define life? But anyway, back to the point I wanted to make, you might say, well, we've had 12 other states pass these fetal heartbeat bills, and they went nowhere. Today, technically, this bill is in effect. Not just technically, realistically, it is in effect. Why so? I won't get into all the details now. We might cover some more of it in the next hour. But the law is a little different. What it does is it grants private citizens anywhere in the United States the right to sue someone who helps a woman have an abortion in the state of Texas. So that means that if you came to this state from another state and you had an abortion, this would give you standing to sue. And a woman having an abortion, by the way, cannot be sued under the new law. So again, don't take all the statements that are going to be made today in the press, because again, as we have said on this program so often, use some discernment. But it is kind of intriguing right now that indeed this bill, which was passed and now is law, is actually being implemented. And so it's a different kind of way to have addressed this issue of abortion, and we will certainly follow what happens over the next couple of days. Just before we take a break, though, let me point you to our website, which is pointofview.net. For those of you that receive an email, you perhaps have already received an email from me. For the last 2 days, I've been talking about the fact that there is a bill which passed the House called H.R. 4. Now, it has a very intriguing title. It's called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I think you're intelligent enough to know that sometimes when they give it a nice sounding name, that's not reason enough to believe it. I mean, the Equality Act is actually an attempt to limit everything from religious liberty to enact all sorts of policies with the LGBTQ agenda. As much as many of us may have respect for John Lewis, this is really a different attempt to try to affect election integrity. And H.R. 1, which we encourage you to contact your senators, really isn't going anywhere. Not just part for, at least in part, maybe a little bit, but not just due to the letters and emails you've sent. But many people recognize that it probably would be unconstitutional, because you'd be requiring the federal government to take over what ultimately are the laws that are supposed to be passed by the various states. And you can go to the United States Constitution. That would be Article 1, Section 4 to find that out. But H.R. 4 tries to do it in a little different way. Instead of actually having the federal government take over all the laws and invalidate any state law, including state laws that require a picture ID, which we've talked about on this program before, is universally accepted. It is amazing how few individuals you can find that are saying, you know, I really think it's a bad idea to have photo ID. But there are some, I understand that. But this instead would say that what we would require is for the federal judiciary, in particular the Judicial Department, which oftentimes is going to be looking at these issues, to pre-clear all sorts of laws. And that goes back to something that was implemented when we did indeed have a great deal of segregation and discrimination, in which certain localities actually had to pre-clear their various drawings and lines for various kinds of voting to make sure that it would allow for minority representation. But this now empowers basically these career lawyers in the Department of Justice to be able to vet any state voting law, not just the ones in terms of whether or not there's been gerrymandering taking place, which always takes place. And so this one is sometimes seen as a compromise, but in many ways I think is just as dangerous and just as concerning as H.R. 1. So we'll talk more about that, but I want to encourage you that if you have been waiting for the next marching orders for taking action, go down to our website today, pointofview.net, click on that button that says Take Action, and there's an opportunity for you to contact your 2 United States senators on H.R. 4. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Robert Jeffress right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about envy and the irony of politicians using it to advance their progressive agenda. Today, I'd like to extend this discussion based on some of the insights from Ann Hendershot, who writes about this in her essay and book. First, let's distinguish the difference between greed and envy. In so many cases, people who are greedy may ruin their lives, but not necessarily the lives of others. By contrast, envy can contaminate many more in society and usually requires the coercive power of the state. That may take the form of seizing land, imposing taxes, and regulating activities. Philosophers warned of the corrosive nature of envy. Aristotle described envy as the pain caused by the good fortune of others. Immanuel Kant observed that rather than seeking their own happiness, the envious devote their energies to destroying the happiness of others. Envy is also what drove the creation of the progressive income tax in this country. As I've discussed in previous commentaries, several 19th century government leaders wanted to implement an income tax on the wealthy. The Supreme Court ruled back then that such a tax was unconstitutional because it only targeted one group. The push for a constitutional amendment permitting a progressive income tax was promoted as a means to soak the rich. The Great Depression provided a justification for expanding the income tax. The top marginal rate was 90%. Some even tried to raise it to 99.5% for incomes over $100,000. Today, politicians aren't as likely to call for a tax to soak the rich, but you'll hear many arguing that the rich must pay their fair share. Envy is still being used to promote progressive policies. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just a minute ago, I mentioned that we did send out an email this morning about H.R. 4, so I want to get back into that a little bit later this hour and certainly next hour. But one of the other things we sent out was last night, just how to pray for Afghanistan. And there are so many ministries right now that have been mobilizing prayer. I'm thinking of Voice of the Martyrs and Open Doors and, of course, Samaritan's Purse. And the list is quite long, so I'm sure I'll leave a few out. But one of the things that we encouraged you to do is not only to pray for those in authority, the president, the vice president, secretary of state, secretary of defense, but also to pray for the Americans left behind. Now, some are saying, well, it's only a few. The New York Times said, well, maybe it's a few hundreds. I think it's more than that, but okay, I'll take their numbers at the moment. But one of the things that Jim Garrity points out here is, for many obvious reasons, the news organizations are not really eager to report the full names and locations of these Americans and green card holders. I think you know why. I mean, first of all, there's a bias. They don't want to make it look bad in terms of the president, but there's a bigger issue, and that is they do not want to put any of these individuals who are now behind this Afghanistan Taliban curtain to actually be attacked. So let me read from his one piece about a particular green card holder. Then I want to talk about some American citizens and students that are there, just to give you a sense
of why this is worthy of your prayers and why, if indeed the Taliban is not forthcoming to provide these individuals with safe passage, I suspect there'll be some kind of, if not official military action, something that is a little bit like what we talked about yesterday, the Pineapple Express going in to try to take those out. But first of all, Jim Garrity says this way: right now, somewhere in Afghanistan, there's a U.S. green card holder who was living in Maryland earlier this year. He had worked with the Americans, done excellent work, and qualified for a green card. Green card holders, I should say, are granted authorization to live and work in the United States on a permanent basis. They're often on the last step before applying for U.S. citizenship. Charlie Cook, who I quoted yesterday, said it's not a visa, it's not a temporary permission slip, it's a permanent residency. So we're talking about an individual that would have been probably within a few years citizen of the United States in good standing. So he says during the evacuation, the U.S. State Department said that the evacuation of citizens and green card holders were both top priorities. But green card holders quickly disappeared from the administration's statements and statistics thereafter. He goes on to say this green card holder is married, has 6 children. His wife's parents did not want her moving with him to the U.S., so the husband and father moved to America and sent money back to support his family. In early August, this green card holder could see the Taliban were advancing quickly. He went back to Afghanistan to try to get his wife and his 6 children out. Of course, there have been people trying to get him out, and I could read some of these really tragic texts that have come, but I want to spare you because these are just going to be really sad stories for a long time. Let me take one from the New York Times, okay? New York Times, for more than a week, this individual, Nadiri, I won't even try to pronounce the first name, doesn't really matter, a U.S. legal permanent resident, waited days and nights with his wife and son outside the airport in Kabul, Afghanistan, hoping to be let out so that they could leave on one of the dozen of daily flights out. But on Monday, after being told that no more people would be allowed inside the airport gate, he and his family returned to their apartment in Kabul with no clear path back to Philadelphia, where he has been living since last year. He is among the hundreds of U.S. citizens and potentially thousands of green card holders who are stranded in Afghanistan. About 6,000 Americans, the vast majority of them dual U.S. Afghan citizens, were evacuated after August 15th, according to Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The State Department has not provided numbers for how many permanent legal U.S. residents have also been evacuated, or in the case of this individual, failed to get on a flight out. Immigration and refugee advocacy groups estimate that thousands remain. That comes from the New York Times. Let me give you another one. This one from the New York Post. A terrified American citizen who was an interpreter for the U.S. military has said she is now stranded in Afghanistan because no one told her the last flights out were leaving Monday. She might have thought some of them been leaving Tuesday, wouldn't you think? Because actually Tuesday was the 31st. So, we can get to it. But anyway, she says, I just found out that the U.S. troops left and I was just silent for a while, the interpreter says. I just can't believe no one told me this is the last flight. She says she's now more terrified than during any of her missions helping the military over 14 years. They left us to whom? To those people who've always wanted to kill us. This is now an American citizen. Let's try this one. Those of you in California appreciate this. Comes from the Sacramento Bee. At least 24 Sacramento area students are confirmed to be stranded in Afghanistan as turmoil continues in Kabul, according to school officials. The San Juan Unified School District staff said 24 students, down from the initial estimate of 150 students, had not returned to campuses since the start of the 2021-2022 year. That comes from the Sacramento Bee. I could go on and on and on. Some of them, we have pictures of these individuals, and just kind of a horrible reality of the fact that there is going to be such an attempt. Matter of fact, one of the articles I'm going to post tomorrow is the attempt, I think, on the part of the press to just say, we just need to move on. Afghanistan's in the rearview mirror. We need to move on. And I'm hoping that at least you will not move on because we've left people behind. In some cases, these are actual American citizens, people that you would consider to be Americans. Then there are others who are American citizens who originally were born in, for example, Afghanistan. And then we have also, by the time you get up to these thousands, individuals that are green card holders who have helped us, have been translators, who eventually probably would be very good citizens of the United States that are also there as well. And if that doesn't cause you to pray for what is happening in Afghanistan right now, I just probably can't bring anything else to the table. So those are a couple of things that we wanted to put on the table. And while we're doing that, let me just mention that as you go to the website, first of all, you will find my commentary today. Yesterday, I talked about the idea of envy. I decided to do a two-part one. Yesterday, I talked about some of the research in her book and now in her essay by Ann Hendershot, talking about how in many cases envy is being used to really kind of advance a progressive agenda. You could also, if you want to be more biblical, call it covetousness, part of the Ten Commandments, obviously. And so I talk about, again, the issue of envy, where I say, greed is something which we may not like, but it usually just ruins the life of the person who's greedy. Envy is much more contaminating, and yet you've had this idea that envy has advanced so many different things. Matter of fact, in my fourth paragraph, I point out the fact that many people make the argument that envy is what drove the creation of the progressive income tax. It's not right that those people who make more than you do or have more than you do don't pay more than you do. And of course, progressive income tax goes all the way back to the teaching of Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. But I then take you through some of the history, and the idea that was originally used back then is, well, we need to soak the rich. Well, people have learned that doesn't necessarily work so well with a focus group, so now they just talk about they need to pay their fair share. But I did decide just to kind of talk about this because it's one of those interesting phenomenon. Envy, hardly ever heard a sermon on envy, yet it's one of the 7 deadly sins. But it's not just a biblical topic, it's also a political topic. So if you go to the website, you'll see my commentaries on that. And if you go there in the second column, you will see the information about H.R. 4, because right now the bill that is being proposed and has passed the House and now will go to the Senate would have every state actually have to get permission from the federal government before they could implement local election rules. As I've pointed out before, even this particular so-called compromise piece of legislation, I think if you had Supreme Court justices that really wanted to honor the Constitution, would have to strike it down as unconstitutional, because Article 1, Section 4 makes it very clear that this is a state function, not a federal function. But we'll see. You can't predict, first of all, what the United States Senate will do. You can't predict what the Justice Department will do. And you can't predict what the Supreme Court will do. So I have an idea. Why don't we tell the Senate to vote this down, or just simply never bring it up for a vote? And so that's one of the things we're encouraging you to do today. Go to the website, pointofview.net. The Take Action button is there, and you can express your opinion to your 2 United States senators. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We have in studio with us today Dr. Robert Jeffress. We've been, of course, advertising that for some time. And, of course, I have my book, Invincible, and it also includes these cards. I just love these little cards here. I'll hold these up here as well, which actually relate to all 10 chapters in the book. It is about 230 pages. We have all sorts of information about Dr. Jeffress, of course, Pastor Jeffress, also the Pathway to Victory website. And it is just great to see you.
Great to see you, Kerby. I don't think I've been in the new digs. It's great here.
Well, I'm glad you are here, and it is really exciting to talk about this. And you have, of course, through Pathway to Victory, spoken to so many people. This has just been an outstanding outreach, both in television and in radio. And so I want to thank you for that, and also encourage people to go to your website, because as I just mentioned a minute ago, since Suzanne and I are Pathway partners, we got the book even before the publicist sent us a copy of the book.
Great.
So again, you are on nearly 1,000 radio stations, I think.
We are, and our television ministry, we're now 7 days a week on TBN, and the most viewed program on TBN, they tell us. So we're grateful for the way God's blessing the ministry, and glad to have you and Suzanne as partners in many ways in our ministry.
Well, let's encourage everybody to join up with you. But first of all, I'm going to work through the book. And these little book marks are perfect because each one relates to a chapter. And the first one, Moving from Doubt to Faith. Now, it was interesting because you immediately talk about Billy Graham and the fact that all of us, if we have any kind of seminary education, have some of these professors asking some questions. And after a while, even you started to have a little bit of a doubt. And it was very encouraging to you to hear that Billy Graham himself, when confronted with doubt, finally said, Lord, I'm going to trust this as your book. But one of the mountains that people have to address every day is the issue of doubt, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And by the way, that's why Point of View is such a ministry, because it really helps in a logical way, answers people's doubts about some real life issues and theological topics and so much. And there was a time I went to university about 90 miles south of here, and it was a Baptist university, and I'd gone on to that school on fire and feeling the call to ministry, and was reading the Bible every day and memorizing large portions of the New Testament. And then I had these religion professors who talked about all the errors in the Bible and the contradictions in the Bible, and how the Bible really wasn't God's word. It was just a collection of men's thoughts about who God was. And, Kerby, that just completely quenched any desire I had for the Bible. And it wasn't until later that I got in touch with some people who had some answers that I was able to move away from doubt. My point in this is doubt is natural. I mean, all of us who are finite human beings trying to have a relationship with an infinite God, we're going to have doubts. The Bible never belittles doubts. Jesus never turned away somebody who had a sincere question. He had a lot to say about insincere questions. But there's a difference between doubt and unbelief. Doubt is natural. Unbelief is a settled conclusion, and the Bible warns against that. And I talk about in the book Invincible how to move from the mountain of doubt, how to keep that from conquering you. And, I would just say, if you have doubts, talk to God about them, first of all. He's big enough to handle your doubts, but also talk to other credible people who can help you. Again, Point of View is a great resource. There are other resources out there. We have in a few weeks Lee Strobel coming to our church. He had doubts, and he worked through those doubts and found out you don't have to commit intellectual suicide to be a Christian. I mean, there are logical reasons for becoming Christians. And so doubt is not bad unless you leave it alone, and doubts that aren't answered can turn into unbelief.
Again, the book is entitled Invincible, just coming out right now. 10 chapters, 230 pages, published by Baker. You can look for it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to ptv.org, so you can actually get all sorts of great information from Pathways to Victory. But I thought I'd move on to another one, Moving from Guilt to Repentance. And you use one of the jokes I use about the man that actually owed money to the Internal Revenue Service, and so actually sent some money in, and then said, here is $10,000 I owe you. And if I still feel guilty, I'll send in the rest. And a lot of that issue of guilt that you have in the book is something that we need to address. There are a lot of people walking around now with false guilt and even real guilt that they need to move from guilt to repentance.
Yeah, I don't like the term false guilt. I think there's misplaced guilt. Like somebody said, the reason most people feel guilty is because they are guilty.
Yes.
We're all guilty of something. And, the feeling of guilt, it really can rob you of that relationship with God. And by the way, Kirby, that's what this book is about, separating or conquering the mountains that separate you from the blessed life. And each of these 10 mountains I address are something that people have certainly been feeling in the last year and a half, whether it's worry, fear, anxiety. But the problem with mountains are it keeps you from experiencing what God wants you to experience. And I use the story of David. He talks about after his sin with Bathsheba, after murdering Bathsheba's husband Uriah, he talks about the period of time that he walked around with guilt. And he said, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me, O God. And I've had periods of my life like that. I imagine our listeners have, when they just would not fess up to their mess up in life. And, when you're a Christian, especially if that's true, you have this sense that the sword of Damocles is hanging over your head,
right,
that you're going to be dealt with and disciplined harshly. And, every ache in your body, you wonder if it's some terminal disease, or you jump when the telephone rings. I think it was Jonathan Edwards who said, the unrighteous tremble at the rustling of the leaves. And God doesn't want us to live like that. Fortunately, there's a remedy to guilt, and David found it, and we can find it too. And that's the forgiveness of Christ that forgives us not just of some of our sins or the little sins, but the big major mess ups in our lives.
Again, talking about those mountains that separate you from the blessed life, which is the subtitle there. Just before I take a break, maybe another one, and that is the issue of anxiety. Now, I love your quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald. Don't worry about the bugs, just worry about the bugs and the boys, because he's writing to someone a child that is at a camp. But Dr. Jeffress, we have been through anxiety-producing times with first a pandemic, then a lockdown, then political polarization, now just the incredible amount of economic uncertainty, and even the things we talked about, all the Americans left behind in Afghanistan, and all the things we'll be talking about next hour in terms of the incredible number, 35,000 calls to the VA hotline, a suicide hotline. There's a lot of anxiety right now, and that's reason enough to buy the book just for that chapter alone.
Most people have said that's their favorite chapter in the book because it's something that's universal. We all have something to worry about. And, I might share quickly, the antidote to worry is not to tell people stop worrying. To tell people to stop worrying, it's like telling somebody, stop thinking about a pink elephant. Whatever you do, don't think about a pink elephant. Well, guess what you're going to think about?
Sure.
You've got to replace one thought with another thought.
Right.
And that's what Paul said. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything.
Yes.
My friend David Jeremiah has a great word about that. He says, take out a sheet of paper and put at the top of it, my worry list. And then make a list of everything you're worried about. It may take a couple of pages, may take a tablet. But once you have finished filling out everything, then take your pen and go back to the top of the page, scratch out the word worry, and write the word prayer.
Oh.
Turn your worry list into your prayer list. And Paul says if you'll do that, if you don't worry but pray, the peace of God that passes all understanding shall guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.
Isn't it Max Lucado that said it's hard to pray and worry at the same time?
Yeah.
And so there's a good illustration of the need for us to pray, and we see that in Philippians 4 and other passages. And so we do need to take one of those breaks, but this is a good time for many of you to go to the website ptv.org. And perhaps you already are familiar with Dr. Robert Jeffress, senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, and for many of us, an individual we have a chance to listen to every single day, Pathway to Victory. It is an organization that we just think very highly of, and we've always appreciated his partnership with us over these years. You put up with me when I was interviewing you when you were up there in Wichita Falls, and all the way down here. You've come into the studio. We've kind of known each other for a long time.
A long time. You've heard everything I have to say and then some.
So we're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm not sure we'll get through all 10, but we'll get you at least enough so that you understand why you really want to get a copy of the book. book, and it is, again, published by Baker, so you may be able to find it in your local bookstore. It is just coming out, so if you look for it today, maybe the best place to get it is to find the link that we have provided for that. It's available in hardback or Kindle, and you know that certainly you're going to get great biblical insight, but also just really dealing with some of these very important issues that we have to address on a regular basis, and we talk about here in Point of View. So go to the website, pointofview.net, or go directly to ptv.org. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Pastor Robert Jeffress right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with us today, Dr. Robert Jeffress, and if you are not familiar with his ministry, we do have a link on the website. This book, Invincible, I have really enjoyed it. As you know, I look through every single page of every single book, and
you
yesterday...
read every word of it. I can't believe it. How do you do
I had
that?
one the other day that had a 500-page book, and that one was bricks without straw. But we gave it a chance. But you are so enjoyable to read, and I love some of your jokes, and sometimes we steal from each other, and that's all good. But I thought we'd take just a couple more. Moving from fear to courage. If there's one thing that anxiety has surfaced because of the pandemic, fear as well. I do believe, Dr. Jeffress, that we now have an opportunity for evangelism because it has been easy, especially since we just finished doing this survey of the Generation Y and Generation Z. They think they're bulletproof. They don't even think about death. And then they start seeing people die. die.
Yeah.
And the fear of death is really become an issue. So whether you're a Christian or non-Christian, that chapter on fear to courage, really important.
Yeah, fear is kind of the first cousin of worry. And, I'd ask our listeners today, think about, is there one thing you can name in your life that God wants you to do, would lead to a better relationship with Him or a better life? You should do it, but you're not doing it. And I think most of us could think of one thing we know God wants us to do that we're not doing. And then if I were to ask why, your answer probably would start with, I'm afraid, or I'm fearful. I'm fearful that I'll fail. I'm fearful of what my friends will think. I'm fearful. Fear separates us from God's best. And the children of Israel experienced that. God said, I'm going to give you the promised land here. Now I want you to go in and scope out the land, send the 12 spies. And they all came back with a similar report. It's flowing with milk and honey, but there are giants in the land. But 10 of the 12, as you know, said, we can't overcome the giants. Now, the problem wasn't that they identified the giants. They were there, but they were comparing the giants to their own strength and ability. They were using the wrong standard of comparison instead of comparing the giants to God. I tell people the tallest building in the world is 2,717 feet. It's in Dubai. It's one massive building compared to other buildings. But compared to Mount Everest, 29,000 feet, it's nothing. It's a molehill. And it's the same way with us. When we know something that God wants us to do, instead of shrinking back in fear, compare whatever the challenge we're facing to the power of God. That's the only apt standard for a true child of God.
Another one is from bitterness to forgiveness.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many times we've done things on forgiveness, but I love you use a Gary Inrig story here about a man that was told that he was going to die, and so they gave him something to write with the idea that he could write out his will and everything, and they come back and he's still writing it all out, and he says, are you thinking about all the people you're going to give money to? He said, no, I'm thinking about all the people that I'm going to bite, because he had actually contracted rabies. And it was such a great story. First of all, I have trouble sometimes reading your book without laughing out loud, and that was another one of those ones. I didn't see it coming, but, again, this guy has rabies. It's a sad story. Of course, it is a fun story, but he's going to go bite everybody because of the bitterness. And, in Ephesians, the Apostle Paul says that we're to put away bitterness. But some of our listeners right now have bitterness because of what their parents have done, what a colleague has done, what a business partner has done. What would you say to them?
I would say in my 40 years of experience as a pastor, bitterness is the tallest mountain that separates people not only from other people, but from God Himself. Kerby, Jesus was very clear in Matthew 6. He said, if you do not forgive others, neither will my Heavenly Father forgive you. And I know people have tried to explain away those verses. No, Jesus was very accurate. I mean, the test of somebody who's really been forgiven is that they're willing to forgive others as well. And I would just say, forgiveness, don't confuse it with reconciliation. You can forgive somebody without being reconciled. Forgiveness has no strings attached. Reconciliation has a number of strings attached to it. But forgiveness is a unilateral decision you make, not to give up your right for justice, to give up your right to hurt somebody for hurting you. Forgiveness is when you say, you know what, God, I'm going to turn this person over to you. You deal with them. You settle the score, but I'm going to get on with my life. And that's the kind of forgiveness God answers.
One more I thought I'd mention, and that is moving from loneliness to companionship. And again, Dr. Jeffress, this last year, people have been isolated. There have been lockdowns. We've done a booklet on loneliness. I wrote a book years ago where I had a whole chapter on the coming crisis of loneliness, but I didn't anticipate it was going to be this bad. And we have books like Bowling Alone and all sorts of other people talking about the crisis of loneliness today. So again, that chapter 8, just reminds us that if you feel lonely, you need to seek out. But also, I'd love, as a pastor, for you to address this issue. There are a lot of people that simply think, this was kind of convenient to just in my pajamas watch First Baptist Church and not actually to gather together with the assembly. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, our internet ministry just grew exponentially, and it's still growing. Last Sunday, we had over 500,000 people watching us online, and that's great. but it's a cheap substitute for in-person worship. And I think these pajama Christians, it's probably time to take off the pajamas and put on your Sunday clothes and come to church, because we need each other. We're kind of like those two porcupines in northern Canada who huddled together to keep warm. They needed each other, even though they needled each other. And other Christians are inconvenient sometimes. They're bothersome. But Hebrews 10:25 says we need to assemble together to encourage one another, and all the more as the day of Christ draws near.
Just about out of time. Let's talk about what we can find on your website, A Pathway to Victory. I would encourage you to support that ministry. I'm not asking you to do something that we don't do, and certainly you have been such a good friend of this organization. And can you believe next year will be 50 years of Point of View? Marlon Maddox started it before I showed up, but that's pretty amazing.
And you have taken it, as they say, to a whole new level at Kerby, and we partner with you and just appreciate everything you do.
What will they find when they come to the website here? Because you have information about radio, television, places where they can get all sorts of books and resources and other things. Of course, the book they can find in the local bookstore, but if they'd like to get it from you or like to get some of the other resources, what's available for them?
Well, and there's also a discussion guide for the book Invincible. Yes. A lot of small groups are using it. It's a felt need kind of study, and it's biblically based. And by the way, the whole series Invincible you can download on radio or television free of charge at ptv.org.
And again, let me just say that one more time, because there are some people right now saying, okay, it's the first day of September. Oh, just in a week or two, we've got to start our small group teaching again, or my Sunday school class. 10 weeks, that fits pretty well.
It does.
And again, there's all sorts of other resources. So with that study guide, it's really plug and play, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, you can get the study guide. You can get DVDs of the series. If you want to hear a little bit of me, then a lot of you, whatever you want to do, just go to ptv.org.
Well, again, thank you for being such a great friend all these years to Point of View, and I look forward to the next opportunity. And thank you for fighting the traffic today to make it in here.
I was having some unholy thoughts on LBJ Freeway, but I'm glad I got here.
Glad you got here as well. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some other issues. Matter of fact, off air, Dr. Jeffress and I were talking about that new law that has come into being right here today in the state of Texas, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the next hour talking about what that might mean for other pro-life legislation, what it also might mean since the Supreme Court is going to consider a case in that regard. So we'll get into that. I've already kind of tipped my hand on a few other things we're going to talk about this next hour, because after all, we have Afghanistan, we have the Veterans Administration, we have some other really important economic news to think about, and most importantly, as we're going to a break, don't forget we have a button there which gives you a chance to express your opinion to your two United States senators about H.R. 4, called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Sounds real good until you find out what would actually happen. It would federalize all the election laws and eliminate some of these very good common sense election integrity laws. So we'll talk more about that. We're privileged to have had Dr. Robert Jeffress in studio. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Open line this hour, and I'm going to come back to this issue of abortion, which I actually mentioned the first hour, but since even in the break, Pastor Jeffress was saying, hey, have you been talking about this decision that has come down to not actually prevent the implementation of the heartbeat bill that came out of the Texas legislature? So I thought, just for a segment, and no longer, we'll talk about abortion because there's some other issues we want to get into. I've mentioned before the number of individuals calling the suicide hotline for Veterans Administration during the Afghan evacuation, and you can understand why. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the coming economic challenges that we're going to be facing, and I did pick out that one on the Harvard chaplain. It was pretty amazing, but there's also a very good piece by our good friend Jerry Newcomb, which we'll get into. So those are just a couple of things that we have posted on the website so that you can see how important some of this is. But let's just for a second come back to this decision that came down. It was a decision not to decide. Now, the Supreme Court does that every once in a while. If you think about that, the Supreme Court basically in the original abortion case was a decision not to decide. The Supreme Court, for example, in Roe versus Wade said we need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins, when those trained in the respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus. The judiciary at this point in the development of man's knowledge is not in a position to speculate as to an answer. Now, I point out, first of all, that just violates one of the standard canons of legal interpretation, and that is the burden of proof is upon the life taker, the benefit of doubt is given to the life saver. If you say, I don't know when life begins, then you have to assume that life is there. And we do this all the time. We assume that when somebody comes in an emergency room, maybe somebody in a trauma unit, if we're not sure they're alive or dead, we assume that they're alive, and we do what we can to save them. That's just the way we go about that. If somebody goes into a coma, we don't say, well, that's all we can do, walk away. So first of all, that decision not to decide is something that goes all the way back to the original decision of Roe versus Wade. Well, this is the interesting one, in which the Supreme Court and at least one federal appeals court have decided not to act immediately, at least on the emergency request that came down. Now, let me tell you a little bit kind of inside baseball here. The individuals that are mostly liberal tend to, when they want to prevent a piece of legislation from being implemented, either from the federal government or a state legislature, they go what's called judge shopping. They try to find a judge that will go along with them, and so that judge will then strike down that as either unconstitutional or at the very least issue what's called an injunction. And so that's the way the game gets played. Do conservatives sometimes do it? Occasionally, not so much. But, I can point to an example recently where a judge, Matthew Kacsmaryk, we happen to know who he is because he used to work for First Liberty, actually struck down one of the executive orders of President Joe Biden. So, okay, sometimes it goes the other way. Most of the time it goes the other way. But sometimes, to be fair, you can see each group does a little bit of judge shopping to get the judge to prevent the piece of legislation from being implemented. With the abortion cases, that has always been the case, and you can always assume that Planned Parenthood, NARAL, whatever, goes out of their way to make sure that a piece of legislation that would be more pro-life is at least given an injunction. And that's essentially what has happened to the 12 other states in which you had fetal heartbeat laws that were eventually struck down by the courts, but an injunction was issued immediately. This may not last long, but at the moment, this bill has become law. So it's pretty intriguing. And part of it is because it really kind of heads off or prevents lawsuits, because it grants private citizens anywhere in the country the right to sue someone who might help a woman have an abortion if that abortion took place in the state of Texas. And the bill also very clearly says that a woman having an abortion cannot be sued under the same law. So it provides that kind of protection. A very good piece that came out with Ramesh Ponnuru. Matter of fact, it's in the latest issue of National Review. I'll hold it up right here. It's called Lifetime. There may never be a better time to undo Roe versus Wade. And of course, this has to do with a case that will be going to the court and will be considered. And one of the arguments he makes is that there is nothing in the text of the Constitution that marks out abortion for protection from legislation or implies anything about viability or trimesters. And the point he's making is that the Supreme Court made this sort of arbitrary decision that you really could not say that there would be any reason why we could not allow abortion in the first trimester, even into the second trimester, but after what's called viability, then there might be a compelling state interest to allow restrictions, which have in most cases resulted, for example, in restrictions for third trimester abortions in certain states, informed consent, 24-hour waiting period. But if you go back to the medical issues, which is exactly what is being attempted with the issue of heartbeat, you'll have to recognize that the word viability has changed dramatically since 1973. And also that, as of course Ramesh Ponnuru points out here, this arbitrary idea of trimesters, 3 sections, is pretty arbitrary. I mean, if you're looking for a place where to draw the line at the moment of fertilization or conception is a time in which you have 46 chromosomes, in some cases 47 chromosomes, which is different than the 23 chromosomes in sperm or egg. And so if you're looking for a genetic opportunity to draw a line, that's at the moment of conception. But if you say, well, let's try some other criteria, as I pointed out, if you can actually look at some of these textbooks, many people say the heart probably forms in about the 18th day. So it forms very quickly. The first fetal heartbeats usually registered in about the 6th week of pregnancy. And so if a cessation of heartbeat could define a death, why could not the onset of heartbeat define life? Now, we don't use that. We use what's called an EEG, an electroencephalograph. Now, if you have a flat EEG, and you've met some people that you wonder how flat their EEG is when you look at them sometimes, but nevertheless, we recognize that if the cessation of brainwave activity could define death, could not the onset of brainwave activity define life? And that happens in about the 40 to 43rd day. So the point is that almost all the pro-life arguments are very strong because they're medical arguments. And the arguments against Roe versus Wade are also very strong because those legal arguments violate some of the most foundational principles of law, which say that if you don't know when life begins, you assume that it is there. So this would be at least a possibility for the Supreme Court to begin to change the whole discussion about Roe versus Wade. Whether they would completely overturn Roe versus Wade is more of a question. But we live in very exciting times, and one of the things that's making it most exciting is we actually have a heartbeat law on the books right now. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about envy and the irony of politicians using it to advance their progressive agenda. Today, I'd like to extend this discussion based on some of the insights from Ann Hendershot, who writes about this in her essay and book. First, let's distinguish the difference between greed and envy. In so many cases, people who are greedy may ruin their lives, but not necessarily the lives of others. By contrast, envy can contaminate many more in society and usually requires the coercive power of the state. That may take the form of seizing land, imposing taxes, and regulating activities. Philosophers warned of the corrosive nature of envy. Aristotle described envy as the pain caused by the good fortune of others. Immanuel Kant observed that rather than seeking their own happiness, the envious devote their energies to destroying the happiness of others. Envy is also what drove the creation of the progressive income tax in this country. As I've discussed in previous commentaries, several 19th century government leaders wanted to implement an income tax on the wealthy. The Supreme Court ruled back then that such a tax was unconstitutional because it only targeted one group. The push for a constitutional amendment permitting a progressive income tax was promoted as a means to soak the rich. The Great Depression provided a justification for expanding the income tax. The top marginal rate was 90%. Some even tried to raise it to 99.5% for incomes over $100,000. Today, politicians aren't as likely to call for a tax to soak the rich, but you'll hear many arguing that the rich must pay their fair share. Envy is still being used to promote progressive policies. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Been talking about abortion. I'll certainly take some phone calls there, but I also want to hear from some of you veterans, especially if you have served in Iraq or Afghanistan, because I'm trying, as we begin to recognize that there will be a real push. We'll probably talk more about this tomorrow, because there's a very good article I want to post on how the media will try to just deflect that and say, we just need to move on. Afghanistan's in the rearview mirror, which is hard for me to put it in the rearview mirror or move on when I know there's still Americans over there. But I recognize that sooner or later they will either come out or be held hostage or whatever. There are other implications to this, and I do want to talk about that. We will get to that when I, for example, maybe a little bit later this hour, talk about China, because I think there's some obvious implications about what is happening in Afghanistan that will affect China. But let's keep it close to the one I just mentioned a minute ago, and that is veterans. Because what we have now, and this is one of the articles we have posted, it is the second article. The Veterans Administration has a suicide hotline. You probably are well aware of that. And they received an increased number of calls during the final 2 weeks of the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan. They placed more than 35,000 phone calls to the Veterans Crisis Line between August 13th and 29th. If you're one of those veterans that made that phone call, or if you are starting to feel a little bit suicidal, or you know someone that is, I think this is an action that you need to take, because it coincides with the time period
as this article says, in which the U.S. military and coalition forces were embarked on what could become, and maybe now is being called by the president, the largest airlift in history, because they were working around the clock to evacuate, of course, Americans, foreign nationals, Afghani allies, and much more. And so this is a remarkable increase, and I think is expected. And it's just one more of the impact of this withdrawal from Afghanistan. You know as well as I do that if you take a rock and throw it into a pond or a lake, you get ripples. And those ripples come from not the initial impact, but the secondary ripples that flow. And this is a great example of that. Can you not understand that if an individual served with distinction in Iraq or Afghanistan and then sees this falling apart? Imagine you lost a loved one over there in Afghanistan. Imagine you lost many of your colleagues with any kind of ambush or improvised explosive device or whatever, or you lost a limb. And then now to say, what good was it all for the fact that now the Taliban that was there when we came 20 years ago is now in charge today, and in some respects is in a much better set of circumstances than they were then, with billions of dollars of American armaments and equipment that they might have. And so you can understand why that is taking place. The article goes on to say there was an average of 2,060 calls a day during that time period, with the most 2,500 occurring on the day that Kabul fell under Taliban control. The VA, of course, analyzes changes in call data volume by comparing the day of the week and month, and as a result, we're seeing this as a remarkable increase in there as well. When you also then add to that the fact that there were 377 active duty service members who died by suicide in 2020, which was an increase from the year before, then you can also understand that we're perhaps on track for even more. That was, matter of fact, they've seen a steady increase, according to this article, from 2016 to 2020, and I don't have to be much of an Old Testament prophet or even claim to be a prophet to predict that those numbers are probably going to increase even more this year. So there is a campaign right now being put together, an awareness campaign, which is, of course, Suicide Prevention Month. We are on the first day of September, and this is Suicide Prevention Month. So the campaign is really urging veterans to reach out, to hear other people's stories, to be prepared, to find resources, to spread the word in an effort to act now so they can prevent veteran suicide later. The article goes on to make one other point, and that is 2 veterans who have suffered personal tragedies are also working on their own initiative in an attempt to thwart veteran suicide. These are a Medal of Honor recipient and a former Navy SEAL who are leading the efforts for a National Warrior Call Day, which would be a specific day to promote veterans reaching out to each other. And so if you would like to know more about that, we have that in our website and in this article that came from our friends at the Washington Examiner about the fact that the suicide hotline received more than 35,000 phone calls during the Afghan evacuation. So that is the second article. For those of you that are in church ministry, can I encourage you to consider what you might do now to reach out to veterans that are there in your congregation, to reach out to them? Can I encourage those of you with Christian ministries to reach out to them? And if you are a veteran or you have a friend, a loved one, a coworker that's a veteran, can you maybe do what you can to reach out to those individuals as well? Those are all things that we need to be doing, and I wanted to identify that as one of these other ripples that will come from the fall of Afghanistan, the decision to leave Afghanistan, and the sense of futility that I do fear many people who have served this country well may be feeling right now.
A lot more we can talk about on that, but again, I'll open up the phones to give you a chance to maybe to share some thoughts on that. 1-800-351-1212. After the break, we'll take some of those phone calls, but let me get back to our action item for today. I think some of you might want to know a little bit more about it, so let's go into it in some detail. And first is, why do we even have the state of Texas, the state of Georgia, a number of other states right now passing election reform laws? Well, it's because there are examples of voter fraud that have surfaced. Now, next week, I might just mention that we are going to actually have a commentary on September 8th, which I have already written and recorded talking about voter fraud. But while I'm thinking about it, also on September 8th, we're going to have our Council for Life individuals talking about abortion. So you, of course, heard me just talk just a few minutes ago about this issue of abortion, about this particular law and that is going to the Supreme Court and what might happen then. And also maybe I'll give you an update on this heartbeat law that is in existence. So September 8th is going to be a couple things, but on September 8th, my commentary gets us into this issue of voter fraud, which we talked about recently with Dr. Merrill Matthews, because the evidence is very, very clear that even in a state like Texas, which is not really known for having rampant voter fraud. Nevertheless, he checked it out with the Texas Attorney General's office, and they have 534 cases of successfully prosecuted election fraud offenses since 2005, 510 pending cases against 43 defendants, and 386 currently active election fraud investigations. So when people say voter fraud is non-existent and these election reform laws are an attempt to find a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, I think I can give you pretty good evidence to suggest no, we have certainly had a problem in many locales, not widespread, not universal, but in many locales where election fraud takes place. These laws are implemented in large part to make sure that we make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And yet what we have now is a movement from H.R. 1, which would basically federalize the election laws of America, to the one that we're encouraging you to write to your two senators today about, which is H.R. 4, which would actually empower career lawyers in the Department of Justice and others associated with that to determine which state laws would be allowed. We are convinced that this would, in a sense, be a situation in which the federal government would require you to get permission every time you wanted to try to prevent fraud from taking place in your state. And so even though this is a very different kind of approach than H.R. 1, there are some senators that are starting to say, well, this looks kind of like the compromise, so maybe we should vote for this. So while it was pretty obvious for many of us that H.R. 1 probably is dead on arrival, there's much less conviction of that for H.R. 4. So that's why we've encouraged you to go to the website today, click on that button that says Take Action, read about it a little bit, and contact your U2 United States Senators about H.R. 4. That's your assignment for today. We'll have a lot more to talk about right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Got a couple other issues to talk about, but let's take some phone calls first. We'll go out to the Good News Network in Georgia. Brick, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
How are you today, Kerby?
I'm good. What would you like to share with our audience?
Well, I was listening to the program, try to listen to it nearly every day. And I was listening to the situation in Afghanistan. And from what I've heard on the news the last several days, the way the President, Joe Biden, has handled this so-called evacuation, we still got Americans in Afghanistan. We still got Afghans that's been loyal to this country. And no doubt their lives are in peril right now.
Sure.
And I feel Joe Biden is a disaster. I'm trying to think of the right words down there. I feel like he's incompetent. And I have heard of several congressmen, feels that the condition, the nation would be better if he resigned.
And I think there is going to be some push for that. I'll explain in just a minute why I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, just from a political point of view. But I think you're also going to say that I think some people are talking about impeachment. Is that what you've noticed?
Yes, sir. I feel, from what I've heard on the news, that there's investigations and what, like you say, impeachment, and Afghanistan is we're gonna be in peril for months.
I think so. We're going to pay a heavy price. Well, I appreciate you calling in, and let's give some rest of you a comment whether or not you think impeachment is appropriate. Let me give you just a little bit historical background first, and then some political background. Article 2, Section 4. I just a minute ago talked about Article 1, Section 4. This is Article 2, Section 4, which has to do with the president, which says that the president, the vice president, any of the officers of the United States can be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of, and this is treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Again, people that in the past took a literal interpretation of that, which I do. In other words, a originalist interpretation. Treason, well, I mean, I may disagree with how he handled that, but is that treasonous? I don't know. Bribery, well, you can have fun with the fact that his son certainly has received a lot of money for China, but again, that's not him theoretically. Crimes and misdemeanors, probably not. So it's, even though we have now, and I think it's fair to say, have cheapened the whole notion of impeachment, when after all, we were calling for the impeachment of the previous president because of the so-called connection to Russia or Ukraine or all of that, or then later, January 6th. In either of those cases, I think any reasonable interpretation, if you were to get it from a person that wasn't just motivated by tribal affiliations or just a hatred of Donald Trump, would say neither of those apply for the issue of impeachment. But has there been a desire, I think, on the part of even some of the leaders near the president, even the Democratic leaders, to eventually move Joe Biden out of that office? And I think that was originally the mindset that some people had. This time, a little more than a year ago, let's say, so not just this time last year, but say about 16 months ago, when there was really a push to try to make sure that he is the candidate. Even go back to 18 months if you want, there was a realization that, he wasn't necessarily planning on running, nor would he be the strongest candidate. But I think the hope is that maybe we can find a vice president that then could quickly step in and, due to what's called Amendment 25, remove him. What has changed is that now you have a 50-50 split in the United States Senate. And the only way right now that you have Chuck Schumer having any kind of authority is due to the fact that if there's ever a 50-50 split, the actual tie-breaking vote comes from Kamala Harris. If in any way, shape, or form you remove Joe Biden from the presidency, either an Amendment 25, an impeachment, or you just force him out by the decision to resign, because we do have that example with Richard Nixon, and maybe you could have a couple other examples that you could use from other people in other offices other than the presidency, you would have a situation where then Kamala Harris would be the president, which, first of all, I don't think would be much better there for the country right now. But it would be a disaster for the Democrats, because at that point, then you would not have a tie-breaking vote. And there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that all of a sudden Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican, would actually have as much authority, if not more authority, in the United States Senate. So those are a couple of very important issues that maybe prevent that. So there's a constitutional and historical reason why that may not happen. There's a very obvious practical political reason why that may not happen. But let's look down the road. I think there is some reason to believe that both the House and the Senate could be run by the Republicans after the 2022 elections. I think it's reasonable to assume that the House will be under Republican control. The Senate might be. At that point, the usefulness of Kamala Harris, maybe not so much. And so that might then allow for pressure being brought to Joe Biden saying, okay, you've served 2 years. You'll be always listed as President of the United States, but obviously the mental capacities that you had years ago are not here now, and you need to step down. So we'll see where that goes. And so those are just a couple of reasons why there are some that are calling for that, but you're, of course, going to have to convince more than just a few Republicans. You're going to have to convince a lot of Democrats, both in the House and then in the Senate, on an issue of impeachment. Whether there would be a pressure to force him to resign, again, they'd be facing some of those political issues. But let's take another phone call, because Sherry in Georgia wants to add to the conversation. So thank you for calling today.
Yes, sir. I've heard that a soldier, if he leaves his gun behind, that he gets court-martialed. So with all this equipment being left behind, shouldn't someone be held accountable for that?
Don't you think so? As I've said before, the trick that we use so often around this program is reverse it. Just assume that this is George W. Bush or Donald Trump, and this is a Republican administration, and you left billions of dollars of equipment behind. At the very least, somebody should be held accountable, and it may not necessarily be the Secretary of Defense, but it may be the acting general. If, for example, I mentioned just yesterday the actions by General Franks or General Mattis had resulted in that. Do you think that they would receive at least a reprimand, if not even, maybe not a court-martial, but being forced to resign or something? And so it, I think, illustrates again how the very interesting set of circumstances politically are changing almost every single day, because what you will see is, as we will be talking about more tomorrow, I think the press will just start saying, okay, let's just come on. We made a mistake. We'll just keep moving on, even though now we have armed the Taliban to be the most well-armed radical Islamic group in the world, almost as well-armed as many of our countries that are our allies. So this is something to consider as well. So, Sherry, you got a really good point. And if nothing else, we would have court-martialed individuals for leaving behind weapons or for making tragic mistakes that are seemingly being done almost every day at a very high level. But we'll see how much accountability will actually exist in the military. And you would hope that that would be the case, but I'm not holding my breath on it at all. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, do just for a few minutes want to have some fun with this particular article, and that is that at Harvard University, this is named for John Harvard. It was, by the way, the Reverend John Harvard. He was a congregational minister, and quite frankly, at Harvard for a very long period of time, there were individuals that actually were chaplains who actually believed in a Christian perspective. Now, sometimes you've had some chaplains that have been pretty ecumenical, because after all, university chaplains, at least at Harvard, have to lead Christian and Jewish and Hindu and Buddhist and others on campus. But this is something very different, and that is Greg Epstein, who, by the way, wrote a book called Good Without God. Okay, I know that you could be good without God, but certainly divine accountability helps in terms of being good. He is the new chaplain. And so I thought we might, for just a minute, talk about that, because it's an important issue. And then also, of course, we have this piece on the Federal Reserve and inflation, in which we can kind of see how the government has been over the years trying to tell you, oh, we really don't have inflation, partially because they don't want to raise the cost of living index too high, because those COLAs are going to affect how much government funds have to go into Social Security, Medicare, welfare payments, and all the rest. So we'll come back and talk about those briefly right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I did want to just real briefly talk about the money that you spend and the money you're going to spend in the future and the economy. And I don't want your eyes to glaze over, because all I'm simply going to do is point you to, I think it is our third article, in which David Goldman says, the Federal Reserve is the monetary equivalent of the Kabul airport, which is kind of interesting. But basically what he's talking about is the head of the Federal Reserve, who is Jerome Powell, has, as he said, dumped $5 trillion of helicopter money into the U.S. economy, overstretching supply chains in almost every industry. And the Federal Reserve, is faced with the worst inflation since the Carter era. Now, I had a conversation today with a colleague about the fact that he says, well, I understand that inflation's about 2 or 3%. And I said, well, if you believe that, fine. But you go to the grocery store and tell me whether United thinks it's 2 or 3%. And I tried to explain, as we've had on this program before, that the consumer price index is like a basket of goods. Now, the basket has changed over time. You've heard me say that if you use the same kind of basket and same kind of criteria that we used in 1980 today, you'd say inflation's about 10%. But one of the baskets of goods has to do with housing. And it brings you to a chart that you can see. I will hold it up if you'd like to see it, but it's doing a comparison between what the consumer price index says is inflation for housing. This would be in particular rent. And they put it at about 2%, and what the Zillow rent index is, which is 10%. And it just kind of goes vertical. Now, there are two reasons for that. First of all, you have to understand that some of the rent actually was lower for a while because we had what? Altogether, a pandemic and a lockdown. So some of the rents actually dropped a little bit, but now they just have skyrocketed, and so have the price of houses. So how in the world can the federal government, with a straight face, tell you that the inflation rate for housing, whether it's home mortgages or rent, is only 2%? Well, some of it is what's baked into the situation. Mortgage that you've had for 30 years, 15 years, whatever, is going to not change dramatically, but rent is going to change dramatically. But again, sometimes you sign a rent payment for 6 months or 12 months or something like that. But a lot of it, if you look at this chart, has to do with owner equivalent rent. What in the world is that? Well, a couple of days ago, I found out for the first time what that is. You may know about this, but I guess I never really could figure out how they come up with these numbers. Owner equivalent rent is to ask the people renting their facility. It could be an apartment, could be a house. What you think that would rent for in the open market? Well, first of all, people tend to vastly underestimate what that rent actually is compared to what the market is. And so when you pull together all of these little changes that are taking place, when we hear people saying that the house prices have gone up 17%, you only have the consumer price index for rent only going up 2%. And so it's just one more game that gets played. But I think that you can look at those numbers as much as you want, but you can recognize that if you go out there and rent an apartment, if you go out there and buy a house, and of course, if you go out there and buy food or buy a car or buy what are called consumer durables, that would be like a washing machine, a refrigerator, or whatever, you recognize those prices have gone up a lot more than 2%. So they can tell you till they're blue in the face that the inflation's only 2%. I think most of us live in the world of reality. By the way, why did they do that? Well, because the consumer price index is tied to what are called COLAs, the cost of living adjustment. And if you're receiving benefits from the federal government, could be food stamps, could be welfare benefits, could be VA benefits, could be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, whatever. When we can keep those as low as possible, we don't have to pay it out. So that's the game that is played. And you can read all about it on our website today, pointofview.net. Just before we close, though, a little bit of history. That is, Harvard University was founded primarily as a Christian institution to train ministers in the gospel. And our good friend Jerry Newcomb reminds us that Reverend John Harvard must be rolling in his grave. The America's oldest and most prestigious university, named in the congregation minister's honor, just promoted a devout atheist to be its head chaplain. And that man is by the name of Greg Epstein, raised in a Reformed Jewish home, but has actually been serving as kind of the humanist chaplain, but now he's the chaplain over all the religious groups, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and atheist. He's the author of a book I might just mention, which Jerry Newcomb says has the dubious premise. It's entitled Good Without God. He says, I say dubious because atheism by definition excludes divine accountability. He says, look, even if an atheist happens to be a very nice person, he is tied into a worldview with no transcendent accountability. That means people can do what they want and not have to give account to God for their actions. To paraphrase Dostoevsky, if there is no God, then all things are permissible. So, of course, he goes into some of the history of this a little bit. Quotes, for example, an individual I've quoted on this program many times before, British historian Paul Johnson, who in his book, The Quest for God, said all the failed totalitarian regimes in the 20th century were godless constructs. Paul Johnson says the death camps and the slave camps were products not of God, but of anti-God. And in 1999, Harvard University Press even published a big volume called The Black Book of Communism, which documents how the 20th century, in the 20th century, the anti-Christian atheist philosophy of Karl Marx led to the deaths of at least 100 million human beings, usually by their own governments. So again, we are talking about something that at one time really had a Christian foundation. If you don't know, Jerry Newcomb goes into it in a little bit more detail. The Puritans founded Boston in April 1630. Their leader, John Winthrop, quoted Jesus when he said, "We shall be a city upon a hill." By September of that same year, they laid out plans for a school to train future ministers of the gospel of Christ. And this is the background of Harvard. He says, even at Harvard today, you can see chiseled into the stone these words. It's in older English. He says, "After God has carried us safe to New England, and we had built our houses, provided necessities for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and to perpetuate it to prosperity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in dust." So, interestingly enough, that plaque is still there, but he says, I've noticed that they've planted a tree in front of it, so it's not quite as visible as it was there. Of course, if you walk around campus, you will see the statue of John Harvard, in which he is in Puritan garb and has a large open Bible on his lap. And if you've noticed, one of his shoes is much shinier than the other, because I know my daughter went up and did that because people rub one of the shoes for good luck. And the motto of Harvard was truth for Christ and his church. Well, eventually they said just truth, veritas. And we've seen the degradation of the Christian image at Harvard for some time. But one more example, Harvard today has a chaplain who is an atheist. So if he actually delivers a prayer, to whom does he think he's praying? Anyway, that's a question for another day. We've covered a lot of issues today, and we will cover a lot more tomorrow, so I hope you'll visit the website, pointofview.net, use our Take Action item, read my commentary, and of course, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful